Okay, so I'm going to get started. If there's anyone out there, then hello. Hi, Kutan. Um, so today we're jumping into Nietzsche. Last class, I talked a bit about Nietzsche's relationship to Paul Ray, and I forgot to send the handout. I'll send it around later. Hold on. Where is it? Yeah. So at the beginning of in section one and in the preface, he attacks these people he calls the English psychologists. I think he's kind of thinking people coming out of the tradition, going back to sort of Hume, Adam Smith. So of course these are Scottish, and then he's talking about people influenced by Darwin, and the view he's sort of attacking is the view of his former friend Paul Ray. And last class I talked about his relationship to Ray. I gave a handout. If you're interested, you can have a look at the handout. Or I think most of you were in the last class. So today I want to talk about book one. And on the one hand, he's attacking this view of Paul Ray, where good originally meant useful, yeah, and that we value good and bad from the perspective of the sort of recipient, yeah. And in book one, he tells a story about and it's supposed to be a historical story that originally in terms of valuation systems, originally there was a distinction between good and bad, yeah, where good basically meant rich, powerful, strong, aristocratic, and bad wasn't really a moralized version of bad. It just meant sort of low, being a slave, being poor, being unlucky. Yeah, and this form of valuation, Nietzsche calls the aristocratic, noble form of valuation, and this was a form of valuation that valued strength, power, good fortune, richness, and the like, and thought that kind of being poor and weak, it wasn't, the poor and weak. Well, you didn't hate them. You sort of felt pity for them, yeah. You were just you were glad you were not one of those people. And he thinks that this kind of form of valuation has been replaced in the modern West by this sort of Christianized morality, yeah. And the Christianized morality is a sort of inversion of the noble morality, yeah. Whereas the noble morality values strength, power, expression, the slave morality values, it takes all these things to be evil and then defines the good as opposed to the evil. And Nietzsche, first of all, tries to convince us of the truth that there has been this shift from one form of valuation to another. That's the first claim. And then he wants to offer an account of the origin of this shift. And the origin of this shift, he thinks, is in this feeling of ressentiment. He uses the French. So if you talk to Nietzsche people, you don't say resentment in English. You have to say ressentiment. And you say it with a slight French accent, which I'm not very good at. Yeah. You have to practice. It's ressentiment, yeah, something a bit like that. So I think one thing is what do we think of the status of these claims? Now, my sort of take here is that Nietzsche takes these, at least the first claim, to be just a straight out, in some sense, a sort of historical claim, and it's justified by appeal to evidence. So he thinks that the story he's telling about this shift in values is in some sense, it's a true historical story. Yeah, that's what I take to be Nietzsche's understanding of the sort of status of this claim about this change in a form of valuation. And the evidence he appeals to, so who's read this chapter? What sort of evidence does he appeal to for this idea of there's been a change in these systems of valuation? Any sort of thoughts? It's supposed to be a historical claim. Anyone know what Nietzsche's background was? What his training was? No? So Nietzsche wasn't trained as a sort of strict...
He was a philologist, I think.
Yeah, so he was a philologist. And so he worked on... Bashak, what were you going to say?
Like tragedies or something.
Yeah, so he was a sort of... in some sense, what today we might think of as trained as a sort of classicist. His main area was kind of Greek philology. So he kind of engaged in kind of quite detailed work on kind of texts and establishing the language. So and most of his evidence for this claim about the existence of this shift in forms of valuation is linguistic. So he looks at various languages and says, if you look at the roots of the origin of our value systems, originally the words for good meant things like noble, beautiful, high-born, rich. And the words for bad meant something like poor, weak, and the like. Yeah, so a lot of the evidence he gives for this sort of view is appealing to language. Yeah, and he, in particular, because his training was in ancient Greek, he's particularly kind of interested in Greek language. He gives some examples from Germanic languages. He mentions a few kind of, I think Iranian and Sanskrit, some people who knows about this stuff. So it's a sort of claim that early morality was sort of one that valued strength, warriors, and the like. I think the other sort of evidence that isn't so, he doesn't appeal to, but I think something he's sort of drawing on, are the sort of ethos of, say, the Greek epics. Yeah, so Homer. Yeah, Homer is looking back to this heroic age, and in the Homeric sort of epics, that the sort of values that are there asserted are once again. So I think he's very much thinking of Greece. I think one thing is that, so I think he thinks that this claim is supposed to be sort of historical, but it's not exactly sure. So one thing is that he kind of, you've got ancient Greece, the Homeric Greece, and I think this is something where you had these noble values. But he also kind of thinks you found it in the Germanic world before the rise of Christianity. And I think he thinks that in the modern world, that the modern world is sort of dominated by this Christian ethic that involves this appeal to good and evil rather than good and bad. But I think he thinks in the modern world, there's been sort of pockets of this the kind of noble morality. So I think one of his kind of colleagues worked on and I think invented the term the Renaissance. And you might think that the Renaissance is a time period in which there was a sort of return to these classical noble values. Yeah, and so I think that yeah, so I think it's, and one thing is you might ask yourself about the plausibility of this claim. If it's supposed to be a historical claim, what do we think about it in terms of today? What do people think? Has anyone here studied anthropology, for example? No, has anyone read any sort of anthropology? So one sort of thought, I think he's got this view that kind of that the earliest types of human society were sort of hierarchical and violent. Yeah, they were sort of these, and the sort of model of this kind of early human society is going to be the ancient Greek epics. I think we've got some evidence that maybe this isn't necessarily true. So work in anthropology, if we look at hunter-gatherer societies, that lots of hunter-gatherer societies are quite egalitarian. Yeah. So it seems to me that it's not obvious that so I think Nietzsche thinks that the earliest forms of human societies were sort of hierarchical warrior societies. And then slowly these were sort of civilized. And it seems to me that the evidence for this, it might be that there are certain kind of periods, say in ancient Greek history, when these values were central. But given what we know from anthropology, from work on tribes that are kind of in some sense living in the Stone Age, that there are still like Stone Age tribes in the Amazon, in Papua New Guinea, it seems that a lot of these tribes don't have a sort of ethos that is strongly warrior based. Some of them do, but many of them don't. So I think as a kind of, if this is supposed to be a universal claim, I think it's probably going to turn out to be false. So if we think the claim is that all earlier human societies had this sort of what Nietzsche takes to be this noble mode of valuation. So one thing about small hunter-gatherer societies is that communal like joint activity is really important. Yeah, so kind of hunting together. And so I think a lot of them have very strong norms about sharing. Yeah, and about how one divides up the hunt. Yeah, if it's a sort of hunter society. And I think these sort of norms, and a lot of them have certain quite strong norms about fairness. Yeah, and I think these are things that I think Nietzsche's sort of view is like, oh, this is all something that comes later with Christianity. So I do think that that a concern, say, with fairness is not something that we just find in post, Christian societies. I think in many hunter-gatherer societies, these sort of claims are going to be central. So Nietzsche thinks, though, that in Europe, that we've got some evidence that there was this earlier period in which you had this morality of sort of self-affirmation, the morality of the nobles. And so this is the quote I finished up with last time, that he says the judgment good did not originate with those to whom goodness was shown. Rather, it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, the powerful, the high-stationed and high-minded, who felt and established themselves and their actions as good. That is of the first rank, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, common and plebeian. Yeah, so originally, the story, this is Nietzsche's story, there was a system of valuation that was sort of invented by those in power, according to which what's good is being like us, and what's bad is sort of lacking the good things we have, whether these good things be strength, money, power, and the like. So, yeah, yeah, and these nobles, there was a sort of bit of a revolution here, because they first seized the right to create values. Yeah, so it was those in a position of strength who were the first kind of creators of values, and they had a value system that distinguished between the good on the one hand, and then opposed to the good, they had a notion of the bad, Yeah. Yeah. So he said the pathos of nobility and distance, as aforesaid, the protracted and domineering fundamental total feeling on the part of the higher ruling order in relation to a lower order to a below, that is the origin of the antithesis of good and bad. So good means like us, it's the positive term, and bad is sort of defined as a sort of afterthought. The bad is defined as not good. Yeah, so the original concept is the good, and then the bad is defined in terms of the good. And so he argues that it follows from this origin that the word good was definitely not linked from the first and by necessity to unegoistic actions. So the sort of story Ray is giving, Paul Ray, which I think is a sort of story that we find today in a lot of people working on the evolution of morality, is that what we mean by good, the good was originally the unegoistical, yeah, that which helps others, that which is other-directed rather than self-directed. Of course, because the aristocrats, what they value is in some sense is an expression of the self. What the heart of the aristocratic value is this kind of the value of self-assertion, of a sort of imposing your will, your ego on the world. So this is the original position, and he spends he spends a couple of sections towards the beginning trying to provide evidence for this, and his appeal is to linguistic facts. How does it work in Turkish? Like, so he doesn't talk about any Turkic languages, and as far as I can see, all of the examples he gives are from Indo-European languages. Yeah, and you might just think, oh, there's some, maybe the history he's sort of telling is something that you find common to all of these Indo-European languages, you know, having their roots in Sanskrit. So I'm wondering in Turkic languages if there's anything like this, like what are the main words for good and bad?
Kötü.
Kötü, what does kötü mean? Anyone, what's the sort of etymology? Do you know where it comes from? Yeah, so one thing is maybe kind of when you read this, try and have a look at the Turkish and see if, yeah, and one thing is about this slave revolt is to what, so one question is to what degree is this supposed to be something sort of universal, and to what degree is this something very specific to Christian cultures? So the first 3 or 4 sections, he wants to provide evidence for this claim. And a lot of it is appeal to etymology and to the origin of words. Yeah, so he have a look at the footnotes. It's a whole bunch of appeals to language. And I think one thing about these sections, like 2 to 5, I think they provide a kind of, I mean, those who think that Nietzsche is just sort of playing with words and doesn't care about truth, it seems to me that in sections 1 to 5, he really is comparing his hypothesis with someone else's hypothesis and trying to give evidence for the claim that he's defending. Yeah, so it seems to me, I think the most kind of obvious reading of these sections is he does think that what he's saying is true. I mean, it may not be kind of, it may be a sort of an overgeneralization, but he's providing evidence for this as a sort of empirical claim. Yeah. Now today, of course, we do have a morality, Nietzsche thinks, in Europe that sort of values unegoistical actions. And so the rest of the chapter is a sort of explanation of how this arose, and a sort of discussion of some of the points of it. And Nietzsche's claim is that this arose through what he calls a kind of slave revolt in morality. That the weak, the slaves, the poor, basically the downtrodden, weren't able to kind of seize actual power, so they're filled with ressentiment, and that they basically take revenge on those ruling over them, not in reality because they're too weak to do it, but in thought. Yeah. So by creating this value system, this new value system, that you, the slave owner, you're evil and I'm good, this is a way of sort of overpowering your oppressor in thought, even if not in reality. It's a sort of mental revenge, a psychological revenge. Yeah. So that you've got those who are oppressed by these noble savages, by these kind of these violent men, and that these people create this sort of new morality through this slave revolt. And Nietzsche thinks that this slave revolt was sort of led by a sort of priestly caste. So the sort of story he tells, and once again, I think this is influenced by his knowledge of classics. The story he tells is that you have the kind of slave, the poor, but then within the ruling elite, there's a sort of division within the ruling elite between maybe the older sons and the younger sons, yeah, or the kind of the military sons and those who are not so physically strong. And the story he tells is that the kind of the weaker side of the ruling aristocracy becomes this priestly caste, and then the sort of priestly caste allies itself with the slaves in order to seize power. And the way they seize power is first by seizing power in thought, and secondly, over time, by becoming the sort of dominant ruling class in society. Now, and so he ties the slave revolt with the rise of this priestly caste. So in number 6, he introduces this idea of a priestly class, and I think one of the things about this, one of the things about section 6, I just want to briefly talk about section 6, is that it's his attitude towards it. So I think it's very easy to read Nietzsche and think that Nietzsche, in some sense, thinks there's something sick about Christian ethics. There's something sick about the ethics of modern Europe. And then you might think that then what he's sort of saying is we need to sort of return to these sort of noble values. And I think Nietzsche does think that there is something good about these noble values, is that they do involve a sort of an appreciation of self-assertion, self-expression. But at the same time, I think that it turns out that the slave revolt itself was an incredibly what's the word? The slave revolt itself was so kind of beautiful. Yeah, it was sick, but it was a sort of expression of power. And Nietzsche said that it's only with the slave revolt in morality that human beings became interesting. Yeah, that the nobles, on the one hand, they're into self-assertion, but on the other hand, they don't really have a self. Yeah, because the nobles just do whatever they want when they want to. So the nobles are sort of uninhibited, and they do whatever they want. So, and he thinks that because of this, the nobles really don't have any inner life. Yep. the priests and the slaves are living in these conditions of oppression. They're not able to express their drives. They're not able to kind of rape and pillage and to express their sexual and violent urges. But because of that, they have to repress them. And Nietzsche thinks that it's this repression that leads to a sort of human beings becoming interesting. Yeah, so the priests and the slaves, unlike the nobles, are repressed. In some sense, they're neurotic. And this sort of leads to them having a sort of inner life. They're not able to do what they want externally, so they have to kind of do it in imagination. And so with this rise of sort of repression and a group of people who are forced to repress their desires and not act upon them, human beings, Nietzsche thinks, become interesting, acquire an inner life. That think about the difference between the epic and the novel. The epic, if you read one of these Greek epics, you don't learn anything about the inner lives of any of the characters. All you get in an epic is a kind of a series of things that these people do. Whereas the modern novel, this was kind of invented by the Romantics. Roman means novel. So the Romantics, really, what it was about a new form of literature, the Roman, that sort of was about the inner life. That it's with the kind of modernity and oppression and repression that you get human beings become interesting. And I think the way I've been telling this, you can obviously see the sort of effects that reading Nietzsche had on Freud, because the sort of ideas I think Nietzsche's developing here were then kind of followed up by Freud, and how the sort of importance of repression for art. So you know, Freud's got this idea that you know, in art you get sort of sublimated desires. Yeah, so you've got all this sexual energy you can't express because you're in this oppressive society, and so instead of expressing it through having sex, you know, you do it by writing a poem. That's the sort of, yeah, and so creativity occurs when the natural way of expressing one's drives is blocked. Yeah, and so one has to sort of sublimate all of this aggressive and sexual energy. So he says that, he says, there is from the first something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies. So the sort of nobles, the aristocrats, are healthy. They're like animals that just lead these lives out in the open. Yeah, priests and slaves are like animals in a zoo. You know, you see them trapped in their cage, you know, gnawing themselves. Yeah, and there's something unhealthy about these priestly aristocracies, and in the habits ruling in them that turn them away from action. So in this sort of priestly caste, they're not able to act, or they're repressed from acting. Yeah, and so this leads them to alternate between brooding and emotional explosions. Yeah, habits which seem to have as their almost invariable consequence that intestinal morbidity, which has afflicted priests at all times. Yeah, like they have sort of bad digestion. Yeah, Nietzsche had this thing. He's a bit German. Yeah, so it's digestion is really important. So, but one thing about Germans and digestion, has anyone been to Germany? So the Germans, like when you go to the toilet, you have a sort of viewing platform where you get to see your poo before you flush it. It lands on a little table, and then you can have a look at it. And this, I think there's a sort of German obsession with intestines and going to the toilet that goes back to the 19th century and in Freud. Saba.
And I was gonna ask, how is that different from Hegel's master-slave dialectic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a really interesting paper to be written there. Like, we didn't look at Hegel's phenomenology. Maybe if I teach this class again, maybe looking at the phenomenology and Nietzsche might be fun, because there is this sort of master-slave dialectic in Nietzsche, and in some sense that, you know, Hegel's got this view that history he thinks of is this kind of story about the emergence of self-consciousness and coming to know oneself through knowing others. And Hegel thinks that somehow the slave is in a better position epistemically. Yeah, the slave, in some sense, because the master, you know, just wants to get some sort of affirmation from the slave, and the slave is just going to kind of say yes, yes, yes. Yeah, and so the kind of those in power are kind of going to be surrounded by yes sayers and brown nosers. Yeah, and so they're going to be in a position where they're not going to be able to acquire self-knowledge because they're just going to be told whatever the people under them think they want to hear. Yeah, whereas the sort of slave or the unpowerful is sort of in a better position, because at the very least they sort of know that they're being lied to, and you know they have this sort of distrust. They don't. So I think there's something similar in Nietzsche, except of course Nietzsche doesn't have this sort of progressive, optimistic view about the sort of course of human history. So you know, even in the phenomenology, Hegel thinks that kind of Hegel's got more of this sort of Christian optimism, that the history of humanity is about the kind of gradual awakening and emancipation of human beings. Yeah, and what happens through history is that we discover, we sort of realize freedom. Whereas I think Nietzsche, of course, doesn't have that sort of optimistic view about history and its you know, the arc of history sort of bends towards justice. This is a quote, I think, from Martin Luther King that was, I think, very much channeling sort of Hegel. He used to teach Hegel. That's something I think very Hegelian, but not Nietzschean. Yeah, so there is something in Nietzsche, some similarity between Nietzsche and Hegel. And both of them think that in some sense, that the lack of power leads to a sort of becoming. Yeah, so I'm reading you the beginning of this section. He uses a lot of language that seems very negative about the priests. They're unhealthy. They have this kind of intestinal morbidity. They you know, it's all about sickness, being ill, that, you know, this abstaining, of not eating, of not having sex. They have this anti-sensualism, anti-sensualistic metaphysics, makes men indolent and over-refined, you know, blah, blah, blah, blah, blah. So we've got all of this negative stuff, but then at the end, so you read this and you're like, oh yeah, Nietzsche thinks this sort of slave revolt was a really bad thing, because we got rid of this. Human beings were healthy, and then then there's this sickness. But then it's like, then he finishes this section by saying, but it's only fair to add that it was on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence. Yeah, so, you know, the priestly form that first man first became an interesting animal. Yeah. And only here did the human soul, in a higher sense, acquire depth and become evil. Yeah. And these are the two basic respects in which man has hitherto been superior to other beasts. So, you know, the nobles are like wild animals, yeah, living in the forest. Yeah. The priests and us, we're like domesticated animals. Yeah, and there's something about domestication that we're not allowed to act on all of our instincts, otherwise our, you know, that is unhealthy. But on the other hand, he thinks that it's with the slave revolt that human beings become interesting. And there's this sort of tension in Nietzsche. I think when you first read Nietzsche, you might think that it's all about praising the noble morality. But I think if you read through, there's this passage. There's also two other passages that we'll look at later. There's essay 2, number 16, and essay 3, number 13. These are other passages, I think, where we get these claims about how the slave revolt despite the fact that it involves a sickness, it also involves man acquiring depth, acquiring a self, becoming interesting. Yeah, and being interesting is a good thing, I think, for Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is into these sort of aesthetic valuations. In the final essay, he starts off discussing the beautiful, and he's interested in beauty. But I think in Germany in the 19th century, that one of the things about the Romantics was that they wanted to kind of say, well, beauty's a bit rubbish. Yeah, like what we want from our works of art is we don't want beauty. We want our art to be interesting. We want our art to be such that you can get lost in it. You can spend your life exploring it. Yeah, and so the interesting, I think, was one of the kind of revolutionary new aesthetic values of the 19th century. This was kind of, and I think Nietzsche, there is a sense in which the slave revolt led to a type of sickness, but it also made man interesting. Yeah, that you know, they acquired depth. That you have these we have these sort of self-tortured souls, and there's something fascinating about someone torturing themselves. It's a sort of spectacle. Yeah, you could spend, you know, okay. Saba, I didn't really answer your question. So, yeah, so in numbers 7 and 8, he kind of says a bit more about these two forms of valuation. The priestly mode of valuation, which sort of branched off from this knightly aristocratic, yeah, and then this sort of priestly mode of valuation developed into its opposite. Yeah, so it was the split in the ruling class between the kind of priests and the warriors. This is the sort of story Nietzsche is telling, and then the priests sort of making allies with the slaves and the poor, in order, in some sense, to seize power. And the way they sort of did this was, first of all, in their imagination, but then in reality, by creating this new form of valuation. Yeah, so, you know, so the noble form of valuation, the knightly aristocratic value judgment, presupposed a powerful physicality, a flourishing, abundant, even overflowing health, together with that which serves to preserve it: war, adventure, hunting, dancing, war games, and in general, all that involves vigorous, free, joyful activity. Yeah. So the kind of priest, and these are things that on the surface you may think, yes, these are the things we want. Yeah. We want energy, freedom, joy, full activity. One of Nietzsche's earlier books was called The Gay Science, not like the kind of not that sense, the sort of joyous science, yeah. And he sort of wants to combine these two modes of valuation, I think, where you have the scientist is sort of committed, is not the warrior, yeah, but you want to combine this. So he says that the priestly mode of valuation is different. And he says the priests, he says, are the most evil enemies. Yeah, so you've got the nobles, and the nobles kind of will go around and hit you on the head. The priests are really evil enemies. Yeah, the sort of nobles just come in, they might kill you, but they may get very angry with you, but once that anger is gone, they're going to forget about you. They're not going to engage, Nietzsche thinks, in sort of vendettas. Yeah, the priests, he think, because of their impotence, yeah, that their impotence, he says, it's their impotence in them that it's because of their impotence that their hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions, to the most spiritual and poisonous type of hatred. So once again, here we've got kind of hatred we might think of as something purely negative, but once again, it's a form of it's a new form of emotion. Yeah, the nobles maybe get angry. Yeah, so you do something, they get angry and hit you, but then they forget about it. Yeah, the priest has this sort of has a sort of negative anger towards you, but isn't able to express it. And then they spend their time kind of plotting, yeah, and thinking about how they're going to kill you. Yeah, they do it in their mind. They become obsessed with these sort of things. Yeah, so he says the truly great haters in the world have always been priests. Yeah, and I think one thing is that it's going to turn out that he thinks that Christian morality has its roots in the hatred of the priests. Because I think resentment, ressentiment, is a certain type of hatred. Yeah, it's a sort of obsessive hatred of a group of people who you take to be superior to you, and you lack the power in some sense, or you think you lack the power to do anything about it, and then you spend all your time obsessing about these people. Yeah, you sort of you end up defining yourself in opposition to these people. Yeah, like you might sort of define yourself by your hatred for, I don't know, white Turks. Yeah, and this may be how you sort of you're filled with resentment towards those in power, but because you lack power, there's nothing you can do. So you sort of plot in your head, and this hatred festers. Yeah, and so the priests have a sort of they have this impotence. This impotence, and this is the story of the slave revolt. So one thing here is he now starts talking about the Jews, and Nietzsche was taken up by his sister when he went mad. He probably got syphilis and sort of went mad and spent the last 10 years of his life basically living like a vegetable with his sister. And his sister was married to a proto-Nazi, and they were kind of part of this very strongly anti-Semitic movement. But Nietzsche was kind of very much an anti-Semite. Yeah, so one of the reasons he broke with Wagner was because of Wagner's anti-Semitism. And here he's talking about the slave revolt in morality, and he sees the kind of origin of this, or one is in the Jewish religion. Yeah, so we have the emergence of monotheism. And so what he's saying about the Jews here is that, and he thinks, of course, that Christianity has its roots in Judaism. Yeah. So what he's saying about the Jews here is also, this is the origin of Christianity and sort of monotheistic religion, that we may think it's a turn against, Mill talks about pagan self-assertion be this sort of Christian self-denial. Yeah, and I think that's the sort of, this is the appeal to the Jews. And he says all that has been done on earth, so this is his sort of story of the slave revolt now. So the kind of monotheistic overturning of paganism, I think it's going to be part of this. He says, all that has been done on earth against the noble, the powerful, the masters, the rulers, fades into nothing compared with what the Jews have done against them. The Jews, that priestly people, who in opposing their enemies and conquerors, were ultimately satisfied with nothing less than a radical, let's wait for it, what did they need? A radical revaluation of their enemies' values. Yeah, so what we get in the slave revolt is this revaluation of values. And Nietzsche thinks that with Judaism and Christianity, there's been this revaluation of values. And then Nietzsche is sort of calling for a new revaluation of values. We need to create, he thinks, in Europe, a sort of post-Christian set of values. So there needs to be a kind of second revaluation of values. But this reevaluation of these enemies' values is, he thinks, an act of spiritual revenge. Yeah, so the sort of origin of Judeo-Christian ethics, according to Nietzsche, is in, and this is sort of supposed to be sort of paradoxical. So Christianity presents itself as a religion of love, as an ethics of love. It's all about loving your neighbor. But Nietzsche's going to argue that it has its origin in ressentiment, which is a form of hatred. So the origin of this sort of ethics of love is hatred. Yeah, the genealogy he's going to try and persuade us of. Now, one question is who really cares? So what does the origin of something, its genealogy, tell us? So if you've got a set of values, what does the history of these values and the story of their origin tell you about their current value? And Nietzsche thinks, yeah, of course, that the history, there's something emerged from something you take to be bad, doesn't mean it is itself bad. So Nietzsche doesn't think the fact that Christian values emerge and have their origins in hatred for the powerful, hatred for the aristocrats, hatred for those in power, doesn't necessarily tell you about anything about the values as they exist now. Kutan.
I was wondering, is there a possible revaluation presented by him in which people are rid of evil while still remaining interesting?
Yeah, so I think that's something that Nietzsche is sort of into. So, I mean, the genealogy of morals is a sort of, I think, supposed to be a sort of preparatory treatise that's supposed to kind of clear the way for this reevaluation of values. And then Nietzsche sort of went increasingly mad. Yeah. Now, what does he have an alternate set of values that he he's proposing? Well, as you read it, ask yourself that. One thing that I think, so in the next chapter, he's going to talk about conscience and bad conscience and guilt. And like, I think he's against a sort of guilt culture. He thinks he's going to give a kind of an analysis of how this stuff emerged. So that he thinks that, you know, people would rather will nothing than not will. Yeah, and he thinks that what we find problematic isn't suffering, but meaningless suffering. And so he thinks that a lot of Christian ethics has its sort of roots in developing stories to kind of make our kind of necessary suffering sort of meaningful. And I think he thinks that, I think there are sort of places where he sort of suggests ways in which the suffering involved in the human condition can be made meaningful in non-Christian ways that maybe are not just returning to. So for example, he thinks that one of the ways that suffering was made meaningful in the ancient world is it was seen as a sort of festival, as a sort of theater, yeah, for the gods. And so I think he thinks that our suffering can be a sort of the source of art. So I think that the one way, I mean, in terms of thinking about Nietzsche's positive proposals, he leaves it very, he says, well, we need someone to do this. And he claims to be not the person doing it. It seems to me that it seems to me that he doesn't just want to go back to this noble form of valuation, but he wants to have a kind of, he wants to, you know, he thinks that what's needed is a sort of post-Christian ethics that allows human beings to remain interesting and deep, but without kind of all the self-hatred. Yeah, and I think that maybe the way to do this is through some sort of aestheticization of values. Yeah, so that seeing your life as a sort of work of art. Yeah, so I think kind of this sort of turn towards something like aesthetic values over moral values is is going to be central. But I think it's quite clear, at least in certain things, that what Nietzsche has problems with. Although, as I've suggested, that the slave revolt in morality turns out to be one of the great creative acts. So if you value strength and the expression of strength, power and the expression of power, creativity, then you know the priests are far more creative. Yeah, they are far more. They're just overflowing with energy and will. Yep, they've managed to completely remake this realm of values. Yeah. Let me finish this quote and then let's have a break. Yeah. So we have this kind of original noble morality. We have this split between the kind of noble class and the priestly caste. The priestly caste are the sort of, I take it, the sort of side of the nobles who are sort of weak. Yeah. And then we have the Jews as a sort of priestly people. And you know, like these priestly people are deeply repressed. So once again, I think that Freud, I don't know if any of you have read Freud or know much about Freud, but Freud is I think taking a lot of his ideas from Nietzsche. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation. Yeah. So good, the nobles valuation system wanted to identify good, being good with being noble, with being powerful, with being beautiful, with being happy and beloved by God, and to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, lack of power, saying, and this is a kind of parody of Christian, Judeo-Christian ethics, the wretched alone are the good, the wretched, the poor. So that in Christianity, you have the idea of the wretched of the earth. They shall inherit the earth. It's the poor, the downtrodden. Yeah, that, you know, like, it's easier, it's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the head of a needle. This is a Christian saying. And, you know, I think the biggest Jewish priest to express this is Jesus. Yeah. So when we're talking about the Jews, I think, you know, Jesus is the Jewish priest figure par excellence, saying the wretched alone are the good, the poor, the impotent, lowly alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God. Blessedness is for them alone. And you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity. And you shall be in all eternity the unblessed, the accursed, the damned. Yeah. And one knows who inherited this Jewish revaluation: Christianity. Yeah. And this sort of language here is very biblical. Yeah, I think he's sort of parodying the sort of language of the Old Testament. In connection with the tremendous, immeasurably fateful initiative provided by the Jews through this most fundamental of all declarations of war. So, you know, it's, you know, the Christianity is supposed to be a religion of love and peace, but it has its origin in hatred and a declaration of war. Yeah, that with the Jews there begins the slave revolt in morality. That revolt, which has a history of 2,000 years behind it, and which we no longer see because it has been victorious. Yeah, so in section 7, we get the kind of, this is where he kind of introduces this sort of terminology of the slave revolt in morality led by this priestly class. So let's have a break now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the sort of his analysis of the origin of this slave revolt, the psychology involved in it. Okay, so let's have a 10-minute break, and then if anyone's got any questions, we can jump into questions, and then if there's no questions, I want to focus on, I'll say a little bit up to it, but then I'll focus on section 10. Okay. Recording again. If you've got any questions, then, and you can, if you've got questions, you can ask on the chat as well. Yeah, so, I mean, just interrupt me at any point if you do. So we have this idea of the slave revolt in morality. I take it the sort of evidence for this is we've got this philological evidence and evidence, say, from the Greek ethics of a very different system of valuations, yeah, in the Homeric ethics. And then we've got this kind of modern Christian ethics. And so we've got the kind of two different systems of valuations. And I think Nietzsche thinks that we have sort of empirical evidence for this. And then I think the kind of story of the slave revolt is, I take it, Nietzsche is a sort of reconstruction of how we got from A to B. It's a sort of, you know, we might think of this as something like inference to the best explanation. So my sort of take about essay 1 is that Nietzsche here is sort of engaging in reasoned argument, Yeah, he's got a sort of, he wants to convince us that something's happened, and then he's sort of offering some sort of explanation for it. Yeah. So, yeah, so we have this slave revolt. I talked a bit more about his sort of double attitude towards this slave revolt. So first of all, I think he thinks that the nobles are sort of healthy, that the slave revolt is with the slave revolt that human beings have become interesting, that it has its roots in, he thinks, in hatred. So he says, yeah, so he says, from the trunk of that tree of vengefulness and hatred, the kind of Jewish hatred, the hatred coming from this priestly caste, the profoundest and sublimest kind of hatred, capable of creating ideals and reversing values, the like of which has never existed on earth before. Yeah, yeah, and from there grew something equally incomparable, a new love, the profoundest and sublimest kind of love. And from what other trunk could it have grown? So once again, here, you know, the language, he sort of, we get these kind of evaluative languages that are sort of in contrast with each other. On the one hand, we have sickness. On the other hand, we have profound and sublime and creativity. Yeah, so this hatred is profound and sublime. Yeah, so once again, we've got this other central aesthetic quality of the 19th century. Yeah, we have the notion of the interesting. You know, think of the kind of 18th century, the dominant aesthetic value with the beautiful, neoclassicism, order. You may think the noble aesthetic value is going to be the beautiful. Yeah, the good, the strong, the beautiful. With the slave revolt, we get the emergence of the interesting and the sublime. And so I think that the sort of aestheticization of this, on the one hand, there's something sick about repression and this slave revolt, but there's also this sort of aesthetic side of it, that human beings become interesting, this hatred is sublime, there's this sort of massive creativity, that the warrior just acts. The priest is sort of like an artist, yeah, that they create values. Yeah, and so we have a kind of distinction between the warrior, yeah, the noble, beautiful warrior, and the sort of artist creator. Yeah, and Nietzsche, I think, does value artistic creation. And so that we can admire, I think Nietzsche thinks, the priests for their artistry. Yeah, what a great work of art this is. Let's look at Christianity not as religion, but let's look at, because he thinks that's, yeah, but let's look at it as art. Wow, what a festival, what a show. Best show on earth. Yeah, so we have more of this in section 9. Section 10 is I think one of the kind of highlights of the first book. So section 10 and then section 13 with the I think section 10, section 13 are the kind of two central claims of this book. So in section 10, he sort of now, having kind of told this story, he now gives a sort of extended analysis of the oh, hold on. We've got something beautiful and sublime and interesting coming in. Oh, and look at, he's got to say hello. That is teaching. Say hello. Look, he's got a stone. And this is his favorite stone, isn't it? Oh, say bye-bye. You gonna give Daddy a kiss? Gonna give Daddy a kiss? Oh, he's here. That's you.
Kim var orada?
Say hello. Yeah, say goodbye.
Şirket evinde hani
Yeah.
şey.
Bye-bye. You are so dirty. You are such a dirty little boy. Okay.
Leave it on, leave him on the floor.
Okay.
He will come after.
Okay.
Gel hadi oğlum gel. İyi dersler.
Okay, sorry about that. I just needed to say he's just going to bed. Okay. Yeah, he's not going to come. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting at the moment. He's you know, I'm quite interested in developmental psychology, and so I've read a, and his language is really growing quickly at the moment. He's got his first sentence. Yep. Anne, bune, anne, bune. He wants to know what everything is. And then you have to tell him the name. And then he's learning all these nouns. Yeah, it's cool. Okay. So the slave revolt in morality, he says. So, and I think what's interesting here is one of the central sort of themes of Nietzsche's work in general, I think, has got to do with the relationship between kind of saying no and saying yes, between things that are sort of affirmative and things that are denial. The idea that he thinks in Europe, that Europe is suffering from a sort of form of nihilism. I think he thinks the kind of the biggest manifestation of this is sort of the philosopher he was most influenced by, Schopenhauer, who had this sort of philosophy of pessimism. So Schopenhauer was very influenced by Indian philosophy, by Buddhism, and he sort of tries to he sort of channels Buddhism and Indian philosophy through German idealism. And he's got the idea that what life is will, and will is just bad. Yeah. And so the best thing is to stop willing, which is to stop existing. Yeah. And so life is bad. Yeah, because he tells this story that you know, will is just a desire maybe to eat, to overpower. Yeah. And for every overpowering, there's something that's overpowered. For every eating, there's something that is eaten. Yeah. And so insofar as will is just a desire to eat, yeah, that all kind of life is just a kind of huge circle of things eating and being eaten. And like eating is okay, but being eaten is really bad. So overall, you know, it's just not good. Yeah. So Schopenhauer has this philosophy of pessimism. That is the idea behind it is that one should sort of deny life. And he thinks that the way we can do this, one way we can overcome our will is through music. So when we listen to music, yeah, that somehow this experience calms the will. And it's like, you know, listening to classical music is the kind of 19th century German equivalent to Buddhist nirvana. It's a bit easier in the 19th century Germany. Like for the Buddhists, you have to kind of go to no, you could just go to the music hall and listen to a bit of Wagner. You don't need to kind of do all of the yoga or anything like that. But yeah, so and so one thing is he thinks that one of the central themes in this section is that noble morality is really involves saying yes, that it's whereas this sort of what he takes to be the Christian morality based upon good and evil is really based upon affirming the negative. Yeah, it's a value system that is based upon saying no rather than yes. So he says the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Once again, there's, you know, it's a work of art. The ressentiment, you know, and I think there's a sort of connection between repression and creativity. that Nietzsche sort of stresses and is then taken up by Freud's theory of art. The ressentiment of natures are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. So with repression, you have the desire to inflict suffering, but you don't have the power. And so you seek an imaginary revenge, a revenge in thought rather than in reality. I think you find this a lot in Twitter. So, you know, like you've got I don't know, the Republicans are in power, and then it's like, oh, you can kind of diss someone, you can diss Trump on Twitter and get this feeling of kind of overpowering them. Yeah, but if they've got the power, it's a sort of just an imaginary revenge. Yeah, and I think a lot of student politics is about this symbolic revenge. You get your revenge through sort of symbolism by describing the person you don't. And this is, while every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself. So the value system of the nobles is just a kind of self-affirmation. Slave morality, this is the kind of new morality, from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself. And this no is its creative deed. So it sort of defines itself in terms of what it rejects rather than in terms of what it affirms. Yeah, this inversion of the value positing eye, this need to direct one's view outward instead of back to oneself is the essence of ressentiment. Yeah, so in order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally reaction. And I think one of the things, if we're thinking about this sort of politics and ethics of ressentiment, so I think you find this in a lot of sort of populist movements. Yeah, so like right-wing populism is very strongly, I think, based upon this sort of appeal to ressentiment. It's all about owning the libs. Or I don't know, in Turkey, I think you've got something similar. It's about sticking one to, you know, whiskey drinkers on the Bosphorus, or whoever it is is this other that you define yourself. In contrast, the reverse is the case with the noble mode of valuation. Yeah, so the noble mode of valuation acts and grows spontaneously. It seeks its opposite only so as to affirm itself more gratefully and triumphantly. Yeah, so its negative concept, low, common, bad, is only a subsequently invented pale contrasting image in relation to its positive basic concept. So like, if you're a noble, the poor are just sort of ugly. And the best thing about the poor is you don't want to see them. Yeah, the noble wants to have a good enemy, but the good enemy is another warrior. And you don't hate your enemy. The ideal is you have a good fight. You know, and it's a great struggle. And the relationship to your sort of noble enemy is not one of hatred. It's one of sort of respect. Yeah, you respect that the epic hero respects their enemy as an equal to be vanquished. Yeah, and if they overcome them, look, yeah, it's just a sign of my figure. Yeah. Yeah, so the slave revolt is and the sort of the noble's conception of the bad are all things that are kind of involve sort of things like pity. Yeah, so So he says, like, now he appeals to kind of Greek nobility, and he says that the words referring to the common man have remained as expressions signifying unhappy and pitiable. Yeah, so you know, the wretched of the earth, the poor. Yeah, these are people you sort of feel sorry for, and you're just glad you're not like them. And maybe they smell a bit, and you'd prefer not to have to look at them. It's good that they're around to kind of clean things, but you don't, you know, you don't really think about them very much. Yeah, this is the true. And the sort of well-born don't have to define themselves or define their happiness in relation to others. Yeah, so he says the well-born felt themselves to be happy. They did not have to establish their happiness artificially by examining their enemies. Yeah. Whereas I think the sort of man of ressentiment is someone who kind of whose happiness is based on some sort of comparison. I think here one of the people Nietzsche is drawing on is Rousseau. Have any of you read any Rousseau? So you got The Social Contract, which you may have read. I think the most influential book of Rousseau in the 18th century was Emile. Yeah, which is the story of the education of the perfect education of this young boy Emile, and he's supposed to be brought up out not in society. And Rousseau introduces this distinction between what he calls amour de soi and amour propre. So amour de soi is a sort of healthy self-love. It's a sort of purely affirmative. Amour propre is a sort of self-love you have that involves comparing yourself with others. Yeah, and Rousseau thinks that this comes from sexual competition. So he says, you know, there's some girl the boy likes, and then he notices this girl is looking at some other boy, and then he asks himself, what has this person got that I haven't got? Yeah, and then the kind of the sort of unhealthy dynamic is such that leads to one having a conception of one's happiness that is based upon these comparisons to others. Yeah. Whereas I take it the sort of thought is that the noble doesn't really do this. That they just in some sense go with their natural desires without really thinking very much. Like these nobles, I think are really stupid and unthinking. They're a bit like nobles, Rousseau's noble savage. They're not self-conscious. Yeah, and self-conscious. The slaves are sort of self-conscious in both the good sense and the bad sense. They're self-conscious as we think self-consciousness is something that's rich and alive, but they're self-conscious in terms of always kind of thinking what others are going to think as well. Yeah. He says, while the nobleman lives in trust and openness with himself, so the nobleman doesn't really have anything hidden inside themselves. What you see is what you get, because whatever they want, they just express it. Yeah. The man of ressentiment lacks power. So ressentiment is an expression of impotence, lack of power. Yeah. So the man of the ressentiment, he thinks is neither upright nor naive nor honest and straightforward with himself. His soul squints. His spirit loves hiding places, secret paths, and back doors. Everything covert entices him as his world, his security, his refreshment. He understands how to keep silent, how not to forget, how to wait, how to be provisionally self-depreciating and humble. These are sort of the virtues of a slave. You wait, you get your revenge when you can. You're clever, He says, a race of such men of ressentiment is bound to become eventually cleverer than any noble race. So the slave is going to be cleverer than the master. Yeah, because the noble master is just stupid. They don't have to think. They don't have to kind of, yeah. Whereas the slave is always having to calculate how to hide their true desires, yeah, until the opportune moment. It will also honor cleverness to a far greater degree. Yeah, so the noble morality doesn't value intelligence. That's not a noble or cleverness, namely as a condition of existence of the first importance. Yeah, while with the noble man, cleverness can easily acquire a subtle flavor of luxury and subtlety. Yeah, so the cleverness is not a value. Yeah, the sort of nobleman, because they don't have to repress themselves, yeah, are sort of reckless. They're impulsive. They're impulsive in anger, love, reverence, gratitude, and revenge. So if you make a noble person angry, they'll sort of hit you, but then they'll forget about it. If you make a sort of priest angry, they won't do anything, but they'll note it down in your book and then screw you over when you're not expecting it, and they can get away with it. That's basically the kind of the difference. Yeah. Yeah. So ressentiment itself, if it should appear in a nobleman, consummates and exhausts itself in an immediate reaction, and therefore does not poison. Yeah. Whereas because it can't be expressed, because the slave is not allowed to be impulsive, because their will is subject to the will of another, that they have to repress all their impulses, and this is the sort of story. Yeah, and yeah, the enemy, they've got a different attitude towards being towards enemies. So the noble has a sort of reverence for his enemies, something almost like love. Think about these sort of medieval stories about Crusader knights and Saladin. Yeah, do you know Saladin? Yeah, there are these sort of, you know, this is a great enemy, a worthy enemy. Yeah, so the sort of noble ethos that you find in the sort of medieval knightly tradition, I think, is another expression of this sort of noble type of ethos. That the nobleman desires his enemy for himself as his mark of distinction. So having a great enemy is great, because it's sort of, you know, if you're Superman, you need, I don't know, who is the enemy of Superman? You need someone, you need a really, you know, if you're a superhero, you need a super villain. You know, if you're Batman, you need the Joker. You don't need to see some rubbish. Yeah. Maybe Batman's not a good example. No, he's more of a sort of Dark Knight. Maybe I think Superman is more like it's more like this sort of Nietzschean. Yeah, so the noble desires his enemy for himself. And he can endure no other enemy than one in whom there is nothing to despise. So if your enemy is sort of weak and despicable, he's not really worth beating. How much honor are you going to get from defeating an enemy who no one has any respect for? Like if you care about honor in war, you want a really good enemy. You want to have the strongest, most beautiful enemy, and then you kill them. You don't want to beat someone weak and sort of, yeah. But in contrast to this, picture the enemy as the man of ressentiment conceives him. And here precisely is his deed, his creation. So the sort of man of ressentiment, in some sense, the creation of the values is the sort of creation of and labeling of this sort of enemy. Yeah, he's conceived of the evil enemy, the evil one, And this fact is his basic concept, from which he then evolves as an afterthought and pendant, a good one himself. So like the slave mode of valuation starts off with the concept of evil. You guys, the powerful, the oppressor, that's evil. And then defines the good as that which is not evil. Yeah, so he thinks this sort of this contemporary conception of good is just a kind of is a negative concept. It's a concept of not evil, not like you. Yeah, the dominant term in Christian ethics is not goodness but evil. Yeah. Once again, this is sort of supposed to be shocking to the sort of Christian, because God is good and that God is being, but the sort of thought is in terms of its origin that this mode of valuation, Nietzsche thinks, starts with the negative, yeah, but then defines the good in opposition to it. Yeah, and this, he says, is quite contrary to what the nobleman does, who conceives the basic concept good in advance, unspontaneously out of himself, and only then creates for himself the idea of an evil or bad, of bad. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, how much time have we got left? So that's the sort of slave revolt immorality. We've got like 10 minutes left. Is that right? Let me have a look. Yeah. So maybe I'll do section 13 next time, because I think section 13 is very central, and I think it's good to spend a whole class on that rather than looking at it at the end of a class. So let's just look at a couple of other passages that I think are sort of worth noting here. So I think one thing that is that doesn't come out in what we've looked at so far is this notion of domestication. Yeah, so and I take it that the noble that he's putting up, like the pure idea of the noble, is basically the idea Nietzsche thinks of kind of man as a wild animal. Yeah, the kind of the pinnacle of this sort of noble morality is just living as an animal. Yeah, and that what we find in the modern world, and I take it that this is something that's been evolving for a long time, is that we're living in we've become domesticated. Yeah, so modern man is basically a domestic animal. Yeah, and that really what we've seen is this sort of process of something like self-domestication, that man is an animal that somehow domesticated itself. And as I mentioned before, that there's some interesting contemporary work on this. If anyone's interested in looking at, you've got this guy Ringham, who's got this nice book called The Goodness Paradox. If you're interested in some kind of empirical work on self-domestication, and he thinks of, he's got some nice things to say. So I think it's called The Goodness Paradox by, I think, Richard Wrangham. Yeah, I could put it in the chat if anyone's interested. But this idea of self-domestication, I think is really it turns out to be something central, because that is not, I think it's not just that we are repressed through slavery, but I think that in the modern world that there's no real alternative to some form of repression, because because we've sort of become domesticated. Yeah, so he says, supposing that what is at any rate believed to be the truth really is true, and the meaning of all culture is the reduction of the beast of prey man to a tame and civilized animal. Yeah, a domestic animal, then one would undoubtedly have to regard all these instances of reaction and ressentiment through whose aid the noble races and their ideals were finally confounded and overthrown as the actual instruments of culture. Now, I think kind of in terms of the origin, I think he thinks that the origin of this is in slavery. But I think this idea that in the modern world that we've become a sort of tame and civilized animal is a sort of central theme running through. So that quote maybe. Yeah. So in these sort of sections, I think we get this sort of discussion of the way in which modern human beings, but I think any of us living in large modern societies, live in a world where we can't just react in any way we want. Yeah, in order for these societies to function, there are sort of constraints on what we can do. And so I take it Nietzsche is not thinking that we can somehow go back to being wild animals. Yeah. But he thinks that we need to kind of think about what we've sort of lost through this process of self-domestication. Yeah, which is a sort of the kind of value of self-expression, the value of leading a life of sort of openness. Yeah. So that's one thing. So next class we'll look at section 13. I'm just looking. So section 13 is about the lambs and the birds of prey. There's an interesting discussion in there about freedom of the will. But I think this idea that he thinks Christianity has its roots in hatred. This is something that, of course, is going to be quite provocative for Christians, and this becomes kind of something that then he spends a lot of time sort of pushing on in the final sections here. Sorry, and so particularly on page 49. So this is section 15. He then tries to kind of give some more. So where is this? Oh, sorry. The footnotes. Yeah, so this is in section 15. And here he has a really cool footnote to Tertullian that he quotes in Latin. And I think here I think that Tertullian is one of the kind of church fathers of early Christianity. So he's taken very seriously in the Christian tradition. He's like one of the founders of, Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. And one of the things about the Christians is the Christians were against going to shows. So that, a good Christian shouldn't go to the Colosseum and watch them kill slaves and warriors and wild animals. Yeah. So a good Christian, doesn't do all that stuff. And Tertullian is like, yeah, but the reason you don't do it is that if you're a good Christian, that after you're dead, you get to go to one of the best shows in the world. Yeah. And basically the show you get to go to in heaven is you get like front row seats of the suffering of all of your enemies in hell. Yeah. And then he has this kind of long kind of rant about all of these enemies you're going to get when, after you're dead. Yeah. All of these people who you hate, they're going to go to hell. And you're going to be in heaven, but you're going to be able to watch their suffering in hell. So you know, like you miss the spectacles. You don't go to the gladiatorial shows on earth because they're a bit rubbish, because you just see people and animals being killed. But like in heaven, you get front row seats to the eternal damnation of those suffering in hell. You know, they're not just killed once. It's like everlasting torture. You get to see the kind of everlasting torture, yeah, of your enemies in hell. Yeah, he says, yeah, so this is you know, he has this long, yeah, you know, I see many illustrious monarchs. So you see kind of all of these powerful kings and queens whose reception into the heavens was publicly announced. So, you know, when they died, it's like, oh, they're all going to heaven. But now in, you know, in the Last Judgment, you see them groaning now into the lowest darkness with the great Jove himself. And those two who bore witness of their exaltation, so all the people who supported them, the governors of provinces who persecuted the Christian name. You see them in fires more fierce than those of which in the days of their pride they raged against their fellow Christians. And so kind of he has this long quote from Tertullian about the about the kind of joys of heaven in terms of watching the suffering of the damned. And I think he takes this to be a kind of, and he thinks that if you look at early Christianity, there was a lot of emphasis on the suffering of the enemies of Christians. So the Christians were persecuted. And so a lot of the kind of rhetoric of early Christianity is about the kind of damnation and the suffering of the kind of persecutors of the Christians. So this religion, which is supposed to have its origin in, supposed to be a religion of love, I think he thinks that has its root in sort of hatred and ressentiment. So that's the main, I think, outline of the first book. Next class, we'll have a look at this section 13, which is the lambs and the birds of prey. And I think it's a really, there's a lot going on in this section. So read that for next class. And then next week, we'll try and look at book 2. How many more weeks have we got before the spring break?
Just one?
Yeah.
There is just 1 week before spring break.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. So we'll have to try and get through Nietzsche quickly. Well, next week we can decide whether we want to cut down on Wittgenstein. I mean, do we want to do a bit more time on Nietzsche, or let's talk about it next week? I think we had 2 weeks. Okay. So I will see you tomorrow. Okay. Bye.